Okay, we are live. Welcome everybody. This is John here with ContraBIM, and today I'm really excited to be presenting to you my method for how to use zones within ArchiCAD to really create some early conceptual estimates and do so with a lot of detail, but using very simple geometry. So really the goal for today is to talk really all about how, again, we can just use very basic geometry, essentially simple gross square footage zones that represent entire floors of a building, and how to essentially load cost data into those zones and use these as the tools for really taking historical cost data and applying it to a new project. So just to give you a little background on my overall approach and how I perform model-based estimating is I really look at models as having three different sources that we can use for different levels of estimating. The first level here is, of course, and I'm looking at this, the target square footage level. That is essentially looking at entire floors at once, and then associating cost data with those floors and having a lot of granularity in how much data and unit costs that we're associating with an entire space or use of a building. The second level here, which is in the middle, which really is representing the rooms of a building, is kind of the next level of detail that I like using, which allows you to actually start associating allowances and using square footage costs and even vertical square footage costs, and we can get a little bit more detailed with how we are extracting data from these room elements or program elements, as I like to call them. So that's kind of our second level of detail for producing quantities from a model to be driving cost estimates. And then the third level here is the actual detailed quantities, which most people think of as model-based estimating. Typically that's how they view it, is actually the columns and beams and slabs that make up virtual project. That to me is really the detailed quantities that we can use for validating some of the costs that we develop during the program estimate level, as well as the gross square footage target estimate level. So anyway, what we're going to be mainly talking about today is how we're going to be using the gross square footage zones as containers for really loading in a whole bunch of line items based on gross square footage pricing. So we're going to be talking about how to set up a schedule, or how I've set up my schedules within ArchiCAD to achieve this. We're also going to be talking a lot about how to run reports from ArchiCAD to Excel so that we can quickly add data or load in data from other cost sources. And so it's just all about data alignment there and making sure that you know how to copy and paste things in, or and we'll also play around a lot with formatting and adding formulas into Excel to give you some real-time feedback for creating those different costs. So yeah, it's going to be all about the gross square footage pricing today, which is the most basic level of estimating that you can really apply. And so that's what we're going to be talking about, is all about how to load data into those elements. So, okay, well, with that, let's go ahead and we're going to jump over now to ArchiCAD. And let's see here. We'll turn off my webcam. And okay, so what we're looking at here is these are actually just basic zones within ArchiCAD that I've created. And what we're looking at is we actually have 6 different types of project scopes represented here. So the main function of the building that we're going to model today, just as an example, will be a hotel. And so we have certainly just one single hotel element here that we can associate a lot of cost data with. We also have a retail space that we're also going to use, as well as an above grade parking, as well as a below grade parking. So those are really the 4 main building spaces that we're going to be estimating today. But we also have a few different site areas that we can also use the same technique of associating a lot of different cost data with for both on-site and off-site purposes. So, okay, if we go to 3D, we'll see that these are just very simple zones I have them color coded in 3D the same way that I do in my floor plan here. And so the next step here that I want to point out is essentially the report that's built into my standard template, which is all about taking these elements and essentially listing out a lot of different cost data that we can assign to those elements. So just to introduce to you real quickly how this report is set up, it's actually one of the few times that I actually use the records by columns versus records by rows. Most of my reports in ArchiCAD are set up by rows, where you have you're listing your elements in a more of a horizontal fashion. But in this type of report, why I don't like doing that is because it just gets very, very long, and it's kind of it's too horizontal for me. I like looking at it more in a vertical method, so that I can see individual columns and be able to go through and input costs in more of a vertical fashion. And this vertical orientation of all these different cost codes that we're looking at here, these are all based off of master format, but having these aligned vertically actually makes a lot more sense when it comes to aligning this type of data with an estimate template at that stage of the process. So having it vertically just makes sense to my eyes when I'm looking at it, and it's just a little bit easier to work with and be able to scroll up and down. So essentially what we're looking at here is, if I grab, say, just my hotel, and if I go to 3D here, see that those are associated. So essentially what we have here is what I've created is a long list of line items that we can then associate cost with. And so we can do this for every single line item that we might have in an estimate template. And this is just one really easy way of essentially boiling down all the project costs into kind of a set range of specific line items. So if you work in the United States, then most estimates are typically organized based on this master format organizational structure. It's either master format or uniformat, but when you get into trade packages and really granular costs, typically they're associated based on specification. And so that's why I prefer doing this early conceptual estimating using these master format line items, because it makes a little bit more sense in comparing to the detailed costs at the end of the day. So the process here is, from this report, we only have those, we have a retail space, we have a hotel space, and under this residential here, I'm also associating my offsite and my site area. I'm just taking all of that under that main category. And we also have our parking and above grade and below grade here as well. And so one thing to note here is, if we look at our pricing package, we can see that our retail space is actually assigned to our retail package. Our residential space for the hotel is, of course, assigned to the residential package. The offsite is assigned to that offsite package. So even though that I have the site and offsite under the residential category, it's still going to be dropping into my my pricing packages as broken out as I have them in my estimate template. And so we have a few of these here, and I can actually see I have one additional here that I think is kind of unexpected. I wasn't expecting to see this. So if I go to 2D here, I think that's actually going to take me to another level, and that's something that was on a roof. That's just kind of an old version, so that's why that one is there, which it should not be there. So now we only have we have those 6 areas that we're looking at in the floor plan, and from here we could actually, because these are loaded up with kind of a average cost data already, we could actually just take this and publish that out to our estimate template. And so we'll go ahead and we'll do that real quickly, and I'll just walk through the process of how we link this into our the estimate template. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to just check real quickly where I'm publishing all of these cost reports from my publisher over here, and I can see that I'm already set up and I'm publishing to this our episode 4 5D conceptual estimating, and I'm just dropping this directly under my reports, and it's going to actually create that trade quantities CSI folder, or it's already been created. So we're all set there. And so what I'm going to do is I'll just publish this single report that has cost data for, I screwed up here, and let me pull this over and show you what it's doing right now. If I can, there we go. So because I had, because I was selected on this entire trade quantities CSI folder, and I was under my selected items down here, it actually just exported 57 cost reports. So I actually went through and I just exported all the different reports within this one folder, which is kind of cool. It only took a few seconds, but because this is a blank file, all of these are pretty much empty, except for that gross square footage estimate one, which you can see the size of that is almost double the size of all the other reports. And that's the one that we're really going to be using today. So I'm going to close that, and I'm going to just click on that so that next time when I go down to publish, I don't make that same mistake. And we can pull this up just one more time to see that we did have a report and zones in that schedule there. And okay, so with that, I'm going to pull up my estimate template here. And I can see if I go to my, my data sources, I can see that actually a lot of these sources were loaded from before. This is a estimate template that has that has these all predefined. These are all the reports that we had just published from ArchiCAD, but I can see my date modified here is actually a little bit older. And if I actually go in and I can check for updates, it's going to list all of the sources that were updated from that from the previous round. So I can see that everything here was published out at 11:10 a.m. this morning, and I could go through and I can selectively choose which ones I'm actually going to update. In this case, I'm going to just cancel this, and I'm going to go to my gross square footage tab, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to refresh this single page. And actually, if I go back now to my data sources and go down to my gross square footage estimate, I can see that that is the source that I just updated on that one individual sheet. So instead of updating all of them, which would take probably only about 20-30 seconds, I'm just updating that single source. So okay, coming back in now, we can see that if I zoom out a little bit and if I refresh this again, we can see where all that data came through. So similarly to in episode 2, we talked all about this process with concrete estimating. Similarly to that, this worksheet is set up the same way, where I could actually delete that entire source, and you can see that all the information on the left, including my CSI codes and CSI descriptions, all that got blanked out. So just by simply refreshing and reloading that cost data in, we can see here just by the values that we can see popping up on the screen that we have costs coming through under this category of site work, offsite. Then we have costs coming through for all of these and these over here as well. So with that, what I could do is I can actually see that I'm not actually bringing any cost data through from my building. So I could actually go through and just hide some of these that we're not using. We're not using the tenant improvement, so I'll hide that. But we can see we had cost data coming through from our site work. And these values aren't very much here because those zones were relatively small, and we only had about 200 square feet representing those zones. So because all these costs are being pushed from those gross square footage values, which includes a measurement of the size of the zone, we can see that that's why these are very small. So if we take those zones and increase the size of them to represent a project, that's when we'll see these values start to increase quite a bit. So okay, so we got our offsite. It's that one. Sometimes when you hide these, the borders kind of hide on you as well. But so okay, so we got costs coming through for our site work package, our offsite package, our below grade parking, our above grade parking, our retail. We do not have an assembly, so I'm going to hide that as well. And then we have costs coming through for our residential. And then I have one here that's just tagged TBD, just for is a kind of just a blank one for any other type of pricing package that we might want to use in the future. So I will hide that as well. And then we of course have grand totals, which will add up everything from down below. So, okay, so hopefully that helps explain how, let's see, how that workflow continues. So again, at any point here, we can upload that, or we can update that data and bring all of that through. And yeah, so, okay, so with that, let's go back now to our, and actually, sorry, before we go back, let me just make the point to kind of go full circle with the different levels of estimating that's built into this template. So, and hopefully this doesn't get too complicated right away, but I want to show you how we go from this gross square footage into our overall summary here. So, so again, this is my CSI summary, which is really my overall cost summary for the entire project. And as we zoom out here, the data gets really small where we can't read anything. But just by looking at this, we can see where we have cost coming through. So we have cost again over here under my site work, offsite, and the same as coming through from all those different cost packages that we had there. So let me zoom in here, and we'll just zoom all the way into the building. And what we're looking at here is we have one column here for gross square footage zones. So that's all we're really talking about today, is just the gross square footage zones. But in my introduction, I'd mentioned that we can have costs coming through being driven from the program spaces or the room zones as well. So this is the next level of cost detail. And then if you saw the episode 2 where we talked about concrete, this would be the third level of detail. And then of course we have a package total. So what's nice about this type of workflow is we can, through this mentality, we can actually transition our costs from a very simple level of gross square footage zones. And then as we get more detailed, we can start turning on cost driving from, say, the rooms, and we can turn off cost here. And we can, as we get more and more detailed and we have model elements coming through from the design, then we can then transition from one level of detail to the next level of detail, which I think is really powerful and something that makes it really convenient to go from a very high level, representing your full level of cost detail, even for a lot of those elements that you would really probably never even model, such as, communications or some of these items down here where you probably have costs coming through and need to account for them, but you're never going to really get to this detailed level of estimating early on in the target level of estimating phase, which it's using these gross square footage zones. It's just a way that we can assign cost without having any detail in the models. So, okay, hopefully that all makes sense. What we're going to be looking at today is really just going to be this target gross square footage. So I'm going to turn off my rooms and I'm going to turn off my models, and I can actually I could turn off my totals as well, so that all we're looking at in this estimate template is essentially just the target gross square footage. And again, just like I did on the other sheet, I could go through and I could hide the ones that we're not using. But for the sake of moving on with through this tutorial, I'm not going to do that because we'll probably be using just the gross square footage for the rest of the way, adding up specific costs. So, okay, hopefully that makes sense for how I go from this gross square footage getting pulled into my CSI summary here. And these values here are just going through, and I won't get too much into these formulas, but all this is doing is it's looking up from my gross square footage sheet, going through and looking for the criteria of finding that value there in my CSI code. And so that's how these are pulling them through based off specific criteria based on the packages. And so that's how we can just take all this data and roll it through into a summary pretty easily with just a few formulas. So, okay, so with that, let's go ahead and let's go through and let's just quickly do some modeling here. And we're just going to represent a building, and we can have some fun with this and just quickly build a hotel project. And so where I'm going to start here is I'm going to actually start with my stories, and because I have a below street level parking or underground parking, I'm going to actually create a few stories down below, and I'm just going to set these to probably 12 feet. Oh, where is it? 12 feet there, 12 feet there. And we'll just go down 3 stories of parking. So I'm going to call this B3, B2, B1, and then we have our street level. Our level 2, we could probably step this up maybe to. Usually you have a little bit higher floor-to-floor height on your first level, just to be able to get other big trucks in and utility type vehicles. Our level 2, we could just go maybe 11 feet. Level 3, so I'm going to call this P2 for parking level, P3, P4. So we'll do 4 levels of parking above grade. And then from there, I'm going to insert above, and I'm just going to call this a podium. And from there, I'm going to call this just level 6, or we could call it R6. And from here up, we could just go 10 feet. And we'll just go up, maybe we'll make this a 20-story hotel. So I'm not really paying attention to any sort of design criteria, such as looking at maximum floor areas or anything like that. This is really just for the purpose of walking through the exercise of looking at how we can use zones for creating model-based estimates on a very conceptual level. So I'm just going to finish these out real quick because I started doing it. Probably didn't even need to, but that's okay. And maybe when we get up here to, we'll go up through R18, and maybe we'll call this penthouse 1 and penthouse 2 for the suites. And above our roof level, let's just add in a high roof. And okay, so with that, we're essentially creating the basic structure of a building that we have 3 below story levels or below street levels. We have 3 above street parking levels, and then from our podium all the way up, we just have residential levels. So, okay, so with that, let's go ahead and we'll just hit OK, and we'll let that create all of our stories. And all my zones were associated on my first floor. So from here, let's go ahead and let's just start by, I just want to get an idea of the overall footprint for my space. So I'm just going to go with a, let's just do, say, like a 250 foot site by 150 feet. So just real quickly, I'm going to get a boundary here, and that's going to tell me I'm at about 37,000 square feet. And so for this first level, we're going to actually have multiple uses. So what I was picturing is one of the uses is going to be a retail space. And maybe that retail space is, on a street front, if this is a street front out here. And maybe I'll take my site and just to kind of map out the basic shape of my project here, I'm going to take my site and I'll just pull this down here, and I'm going to add in this direction, and we'll just make our site essentially just, a streetscape in this case. And so now we're just creating just a basic shape to represent the site on our level 1 area. We have our retail space. I could actually take the hotel space, and maybe the hotel has, a lobby that comes in, to about there with maybe some back of house spaces. And then we would have a Of course, we would need a parking level and some parking functions over here. So maybe I would have a ramping system or something like that. And with this, I'm going to just simply pull this across. And okay, so now we have essentially a basic outline of a program of building. And I'm just going to come out here, and just like I did with the site, I'm going to take my offsite and I will kind of wrap the corner there with that offsite. So the site and offsite are kind of tricky to estimate those based off gross square footage. You really have to start looking at the numbers calculated based off what you plug into it to get the right values for, say, like offsite utilities for water and power, or any sort of B permit type work, or public works type improvements beyond the property line of your site. Those are kind of tough to quantify or to estimate sometimes using gross square footage values. But once you get into Excel, you can quickly just tweak those gross square footage values to give you really a ballpark of what that cost is that will be associated with it. So, okay, so the last thing that we want to do here is I'm going to actually take this below grade parking, and I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to go down one story, and I'll actually turn on my level 1 as just a trace reference, and I'll paste this in, and I'm just going to make this entire footprint below my building as my parking level. So, okay, so there we go. And if we go to 3D, we can see that we've just taken those zones that we had created and just modifying them to create essentially a basic shape of the building that we want. So, okay, with that, before we start doing a lot of copying with this, I want to show you how we can take this data that we've created already just by looking at this report right here. We essentially have placed all of these into the location of the project, how we want them. And so now these measured areas are really going to start giving us better cost feedback for those individual spaces. So, so let's talk a little bit now about how we can export this to Excel and condition this data within Excel. So what we are going to do is we're going to be using the under interoperability, we're going to be using the classifications and properties function, and we're going to essentially just export property values from the schedule. So I'm going to be sending this to my episode 4 reports, and I'm going to be sending it to my data exchange folder. And you can see I've already done this once, but we're going to actually just overwrite that file with this existing report, and we will open that up. And so I'm going to hit save, and we will replace it. And so that should be opening up. And I have noticed that at least, I don't know if other people have experienced this also, but especially when you have an Excel workbook with macros in it, I've noticed that sometimes I get some funky things when I have multiple files open. So I'm actually going to close my ContraBIM estimate template, and we're just going to be looking just at the property values that we exported from ArchiCAD. So what's really nice about this is, and let me just, I'm going to unhide this over here just to show you really how this all works, this exchange with ArchiCAD. And I'm going to wrap the text up here. So what's cool about this is these up here are, you can see in this top left corner, we have property and element GUIDs. So what's cool about this is exporting properties from ArchiCAD actually generates a GUID for those property values themselves. So you can see that not everything has a property GUID, but you can see the just by looking at this, everything with a GUID over here is all data that we can actually modify within Excel here and import back in. So the ones without them, such as the measured values like perimeter and area and height, these are of course measured from the model, and we cannot import those values back in because they don't have a GUID, and really those are being measured from the geometry itself. But you can see up here at the top, we also have the GUIDs for those zones that we have created. So as long as you have the GUID in this direction and this direction, and when you load those values in, as long as ArchiCAD can correlate the two GUIDs, these values will be importable. So one thing I want to point out here is we can see that all the values here, they have this little notice, and what it's telling us is the number in this cell is formatted as text or preceded by an apostrophe. So we actually have to, before we can really start manipulating this information and running reports here, because even this target gross square footage, this value right here, if I zero this out and if I wanted to auto sum all these line items below it, if I do that, I can see that this is actually still set at 0. That is not calculating, and the reason for that is because these are all associated as text. They're formatted as text. So one little trick to fix that issue that I've found, which is really, really useful in this type of scenario, is what we need to do is we just need to, I typically just type in a 0 and I just copy that value. And then I can come in here and I can highlight all these values that I want to essentially convert from a text to a number. And what you would do to do that is you would just highlight all those cells and you would come in and you would do a paste special. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually just do a operation, and we're going to add. And essentially we're just adding 0 to all these values out here that are formatted as text. And so by doing this, what this is going to do is it's going to just convert all those to numbers. So as we do that, we can see they all changed in formatting, and we could actually bump up our our decimal point. And if we wanted, we could change that to currency, but I'm just going to leave it as a number for right now. So, and we can also see that because we had formulated in that one cell, we can see that that actually added up all of our values there. So if I start changing these from say 5 to 8 or something, that's going to automatically change. So okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to give this a little bit of a highlight here. And so our this is essentially summing up our total target gross square footage cost of these individual spaces. So right now these are still just numbers over here. So what I'm going to do is I can just take that formula, and it actually has that +0 that we added, which we don't really need here. We can get rid of that. And I'm just going to take this and I can pull those across. Those values didn't change, but now if I start coming in here and start tweaking on these, it's going to give me some live feedback. And so one thing that's really cool about this now is we could actually start adding cells and columns in between this data. So for example, over here, like this underground parking, maybe we want to start looking at this and getting some real-time cost feedback from this Excel sheet to understand what these values actually mean in terms of representing the space that is 37,500 square feet. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually insert a value here, and I'm going to just go to my top value right here, and I'm going to just say equals. I'm going to take my gross square footage value from all these line items, and I'm going to come up to the formula bar and just multiply that by my measured area of that space. And so if I hit OK, we can now see that value, we could change this to a currency, and I'm going to get rid of those decimal points. So that's telling me that I have 187,000 associated with that individual line item for my general requirements. So I could take this, and if I started pulling it down, it's going to start getting messed up because my formula essentially is going to be moving with it. So in order to fix that, we just need to come up here and real simply, I'm going to enter into this G10 cell. If I put a $sign right there, that will keep the 10 from moving. I want the G to still move because I could take this entire column and copy it and duplicate it for these other zones that we're going to be estimating. But if we put the $sign right there in front of the 10, it'll maintain using that individual cell. So that value doesn't change, but I can take this and pull it down, and that's going to tell me where my cost is coming through. And I could actually take these, and I sometimes like using a different format for these. Under the custom, I like using, which one is it? It would be this one right here, this kind of special format, which will, it moves the $sign over, and instead of listing zeros, it just gives you a little dash mark, which I think is kind of a nice way of looking at it. And then of course at the top here, I could take this, pull it over, and so that's going to give me my overall summed cost for that specific zone. And of course we could change that now to, or we could take this and do a format paint up there. But of course that got rid of my formatting there. So, okay, so what that's telling me now is that 37,000 square feet of underground parking cost me $3.5 million. And so this is giving me real-time feedback. And up here I could just say calculated cost per zone. So I'm going to bump this up. And okay, so we could also take this entire column here, and we could copy this, and really we could insert this anywhere. And because we've changed these formulas to, or because we've set these just by adding that one single value right there, it will copy and paste and give us the right formatting on all of these. So I could do this for really any of these zones that we have. And we could add all these in, and it just makes it really easy to start getting some real-time feedback. So say for under my offsite here, and if I want to start going through and really dialing in how much cost I'm associating here, maybe I want a little bit more under my my surveying. So maybe I'll go to 0.5 there, just have a plug at this point in time for that specific area. One other thing we can do with this, which is very apparent right now that I've scrolled down there, is of course we can just come into our view and we can freeze those panes, and we can do a lot of formatting with this. Again, as long as you don't start deleting GUIDs, or really that's the only way you can really screw this up, or changing the format of these values where ArchiCAD won't understand it or read it as it comes back in. That's really the only rules that I would have for changing values here. You'd also run into an issue if I cleared out a value entirely. If I made it where it was a totally blank cell, then it's going to have an issue importing that because it doesn't even recognize what was there. So it's something that you can play with though, and if you start running into issues, that's when you really need to just start troubleshooting. But most of the time it's a formatting issue. Is what I've found if ArchiCAD cannot bring that in. So, okay, so let's look at, so really at this point, if I was setting up this modeling effort, and if I wanted to create a conceptual estimate, I would go through and I would just build out all the different zones, or maybe I'd start with a few core zones, and I would run a report like this. I'd send this off to an estimator who really knows from historical cost data what these values should be for these individual spaces. And so I would send it to someone who really understands the cost. And when you start thinking about it in terms of applying historical cost data to zones in this type of format, it kind of really gives you a direction for how to take previous projects and how you can really go through and look at that historical cost data and break them down into just a very structured, aligned format, just by taking the values and plugging them in here for however they need to be represented for these for your project. So okay, so if we go over to what were we gonna do? We're gonna go into our, where is it? My offsite. So my offsite right here, and I'm just gonna, so I don't get confused on which one is which, I'm going to just give this an overall highlight. I'm going to just take these. My residential, I believe I had as blue. And so this is just going to kind of give me some better feedback while I'm looking at this to see where those values are. I haven't added any calculated totals to this one just yet, but I could do that by simply inserting more cells there. So our residential, so that was my hotel space. This is my site area, so I'm going to just leave that off, and then all of this over here was parking, and so we could just highlight that. Great. Okay. So at this point, go through and just really start looking at these values and trying to understand if that makes sense for the site and the scope that we anticipate. So maybe in this case, under my water utilities, maybe that's not even close. Maybe I should double that up, have at least 35,000 plugged in there for a plug. Maybe my sewer, maybe we have a lot or more of it there, so we can add quite a bit there. And you could just go through, and depending on the scope of the project, most estimators could go through and quickly just give this a plug based off the scope that is best describes that project. So okay, with that, that's all I'm going to do. I'm just going to make a few little changes there, and I think the rest of these are set up pretty well for what we want to do with the rest of the project. And so from here, what I'll do is I'm just going to save this, and we could continue working with this. We could spend all day going through and really trying to understand, or we could really go do a lot of back and forth looking at historical cost data from other projects, and then starting to associate gross square footage values to how you want to really use this this information. And yeah, let's go back in and let's save that. And so within ArchiCAD now, all we need to do to load that in is let's come in here to interoperability, classifications, and we're just going to import those property values. So as long as we didn't screw up anything in that file, and it looks like we're going to be okay. So we can now see that it is giving us some feedback on what it's not going to import. And obviously all these columns here are the columns that we had created with those additional formulas. So it's not recognizing those because there is no element to import those values into or those columns into. It's simply just listing out all that data that will not be imported, but it's there. If you have a major issue, it's going to tell you right during this step. And so yeah, essentially at this point, we're just going to be overriding all this information that we had originally exported out. But since we only changed a little bit of it, yeah, we shouldn't have any issues. So let's just go ahead and import. And it tells us that it was successfully imported. And okay, so there we go. And at this point, we could certainly just go back to our publisher and republish this. And to update our estimate, I'm going to go back into my episode 4 here under reports and open up my estimate template. And all I would need to do now is refresh. And really the biggest one that we changed was this offsite. So we should see that refresh. And okay, so there we go. We can see the updates, and we are essentially ready to, if we're happy with how we have these cost values all set up within ArchiCAD, and those values are really what we want to use as our conceptual estimating values on our project, then we're essentially just ready to fly through the modeling. So I'm going to go in, and one of the things that you would probably want to do is really change the numbering here. I'm going to leave that just as parking underground as the ID. With these zones, there's several different ways of taking it. So you either want to use, it's something that I always go through after the fact and just go through and make sure all my IDs and my numbers and my naming is how I want it. But we can take this now, and I'm going to copy that. So I Doing a copy. Come on. Going down to my level B2. So we'll paste that in. Go down to level B3. And I'm going to paste that in. And while I'm doing this, let me pull up comments here. If there's any questions or anything, then feel free to go ahead and type those in, and we'll answer them towards the end after I get through the rest of this modeling here. So, okay, so what we're doing is I'm going to take my zone for my parking area. Oh, where is it? There it is. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to come up to my P2 level, and I'm just going to take this, and I'm really just going to match kind of the overall shape of my building. And I could, of course, call this P2, and I'm going to come up and paste that in for my P3. Paste that in for P4. Okay, and then up on my podium level, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just copy and paste my hotel gross square footage value. And so I'm going to just come up to my podium, and I'm going to paste this in. And I might give this a little bit of a just change in shape, you know, give it a little offset from each side. And what I also might do is I might come down to my street, and if I wanted to add, say, like a plaza podium level, I'd probably still want that under my site work. Or maybe I want it under an entirely different pricing package to track that separately. But what I could do is I could just create a zone here that represents the podium space. So I'm going to just build onto this, and we'll just make all of that a plaza level. So I'm going to call this plaza. And good enough for now. And so with that value, we could also go through and just tweak the values that we are wanting to carry for that specific use. So, okay, so for the hotel, I'm not going to change this for all of these. I'm just going to call this level 5. And I'm going to take that. And what is the overall area? So it's 12.5. Maybe I want to go slightly larger than that. Maybe I'll give it like an angle over here. A little leg there. Maybe we want to pull this out. Change the shape just a little bit. Maybe we're trying to hit right at 15,000. So that gets us pretty close. Close enough for the purposes today. And so I'm going to just modify the shape of these zones here. Come on. And I need to cut out a little bit from this one. Okay, so let's check this out in 3D. Okay, so we can see that we are building things up. We got a little bit of overlap here, and I can see that that's because my site was actually drawn to go downwards. Down here, it's actually set below the ground, so the top value there is essentially 0 for these, so that's fine. We can leave that as is. And okay, so we can see that we got our zones coming through, and I'm just going to take this and let's just copy this up. And so I'm going to paste right here, and instead of renaming all these, I'm just going to call this typical for my number, and I'm going to actually just go under my edit, and I'm going to do a move and edit elements by story. So I'm going to copy essentially everything that we have in here, including my zone. We don't have anything else in this case, so that's all we really have. But if I wanted to uncheck that, I would just turn on my zone. And we're doing a copy, and I'm just going to copy this all the way up. So I can pull this down and give me a little more working space. So I'm going to copy it all the way up, and maybe I'll just rename those as I get up there. So, okay. So with that, should go through and have copied. So if we go to 3D now, there we go. We have up through our penthouse 2. So I might change this one just to penthouse 2, penthouse 1, and okay. And then probably to close this off, what I might do is up on our roof, I'm going to pick up, I should just pick it up from this level. Going to copy both of these up to my roof level, and I'm going to paste them in. And so this is essentially the shape of my roof. So what I'm going to do is I'll actually start pulling this back just slightly, and we'll give it a little bit of an offset. So this is my my roof area that I would consider inside, and then my outside area, I'm just going to pick this up and use the magic wand tool, and hopefully that'll come on. Yeah, it's not going to find it. Okay, so we will quickly just, I'm going to just trace this out. So we're essentially adding in a roof level, an outdoor roof level, and this one I'm going to delete. So we'll call this terrace. And okay, so let's see how we look there. Okay, so there we go. That's pretty much all the modeling that we really need to do. And of course, with these values, these are still associated with the basic site areas. So I could of course come into my properties here, and I could roll up. There's quite a few properties associated with these zones in this case. There's a lot of different ways that we could take different data. But because this is part of the building here, I would actually probably want to come in and really give this a value that has some structural components to it also. So I'm just going to add in a few there. And of course, we would want to go through those and really tweak them to represent the scope of both the plaza level and the rooftop. So we'd probably certainly be much higher on waterproofing and roofing systems and that type of thing for those specific zones. But yeah, I think you get the point there. And yeah, where is my roofing? So yeah, certainly we could bump all this up to represent the scopes. So with that, let's go back now to our gross square footage estimate, and we can see that we now have all those different zones coming through. And at this point, what I would do is let's just go ahead and I'm going to go to my publisher and let's publish this out. I'm going to close this and we'll go back to our estimate template, and I'm just going to refresh. And okay, so now we're bringing through all of that. So we've essentially have quite a bit more under our site work, and a lot of these values here, now that we've added a plaza and a roof terrace to this, a lot of these really would need to we need to go through and really tweak what the scopes are going to be on those. So those are probably not very accurate for our site work. But we have our offsite in here. If I scroll all the way down, we can see those values that we had tweaked through the Excel estimate exchange, or the Excel properties exchange. We have our below grade parking. We have above grade parking. We have our retail space. Our residential space is the bulk of it here. And then, of course, we're adding everything up with our totals. And then, of course, this right now we're just looking at, if I zoom way out, we can see again, if I refresh all that data that we came through using those zones as conceptual estimates. And yeah, so all this again is just rolling right through, and those are what I would consider target value estimates. It's essentially just a starting point for understanding how much we're associating with each of these different line items here underneath these CSI line items. So yeah, it's just what I've found is a really good way of taking whatever historical cost data you have, loading them into those just real basic geometry, those basic spaces, which really just act as containers for containing all this cost data. And then you can, of course, just apply it to a project really quickly. And yeah, this is a nice way to establish kind of that target value that you're going to be striving towards with working with your project owner, your design teams, your engineers, your maybe your design build subcontractors, and using this type of workflow to just get that upfront cost projected so that you have a target as you progress through the design. So as you start adding room spaces, you can then really start comparing. There's our residential. So as you start adding in rooms, you could then start really looking at the exact takeoffs for your different finishes, and then you could transfer from one value to another, and then eventually you can transfer it to your third, which is your detailed estimating, which is actually, in this case, if I'm looking at ceilings here, that would actually be the measured takeoff from the ceilings added to the model. So we can do it with a gross square footage. We can do it based on the rooms, and then we can also do it based off the model geometry once it's been created. So, okay. So if there's any questions, then feel free to type those into the comments, and I will be sure to answer those after the fact. And yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video on model-based estimating. And with that, I'm going to wrap things up here. I was shooting for trying to be under an hour, and it looks like we achieved that today. So yeah, thanks for checking out this video, and make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel if you like this type of content. This first series of videos that we're doing during this live stream is really kind of a way to present a broad overview of the entire ContraBIM system, because there's a lot of stuff that goes into it, and really the ContraBIM system represents all elements of the design and construction workflow. So in this first season, we're really just trying to cover a lot of the big concepts, and hopefully you learned a little bit about how we use zones out of ArchiCAD to really drive conceptual estimates. And so again, in this case, for this video, what we did is we had a few underground levels of parking. We had the orange here was above ground levels of parking. We had a little retail component. We have our site work. We have our offsite, and then we have a hotel component with a roof terrace and a roof space, which probably needs to be loaded up with a lot of the mechanical, because that's typically where it is. So, okay. With that, I'm going to yeah, we'll be signing off here. If you want to learn more about what I do with ContraBIM, then make sure to check out our website, www.contrabim.com. If you like what you see with this type of template system and you think that it could be useful for your own practices, then check out the ContraBIM network, which is a way that we are sharing all of these different tutorial files, as well as the project template files, and really all the settings and components that make up this entire template, because there's a lot that goes into all of this. All we were really looking at today was just one small component, which was just one report. But of course, there's a lot that goes into building out rooms. We have a lot for individual cost data, and there's really just a ton that is built into this template for everything from design scheduling through estimating, scheduling, quality control, commissioning. We've really built out reports to represent each of the different elements of construction and the different types of reports most GCs would have to build and manage and track over the course of design to construction. So, okay, I'm going to sign off here. And yeah, if you have any questions, then feel free to reach out to me or leave comments in the comment section. And yeah, I hope to see you on next week's tutorial, which I'm still going back and forth on what we're going to do, but I think we're going to be building a 3D site logistics plans, and we're going to be adding a lot of different types of elements to it, different equipment and different site logistics measures, and we'll have fun with building a 3D site next week, and hope you can join us then. And what day will that be? That'll be on the 15th. So, okay, signing off here, and yeah, thanks for checking it out, and I will see you on the next live stream.